Here today for the interview is Dr. George Sugai. George is professor emeritus at the University of Connecticut, having retired in 2019. His research and practice interests include school-wide positive behavioral support, behavioral disorders, applied behavioral analysis, organizational management, classroom and behavioral management, and school discipline. He has been a classroom teacher, a program director, a personnel preparer, and an applied researcher. Currently, he is a senior advisor for the OSEP Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. And listeners, of course, as you just heard, George was a monumental figure and influence on the trajectory of my career. So I am personally thrilled to have George here today. So, George, I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Good to see you, Tom.
It's great to see you. And all I can say, George, is that if I were to put together a Mount Rushmore of influencers on my career, you definitely would be on there, and maybe even be my first choice. And so
well,
I'm really
it's a little worrisome that I may be responsible for your behaviors, but
it's too late now, George. You've had too much influence me over the years.
Good and bad.
Well, I'll take it for sure. There, of course, is a ton to get to. And of course, we're going to do this in two parts. So listeners, you are going to get 2 weeks of George. You'll get a double dose as we head into the winter break. But before we get into the specific topics of our conversation, I want to ask you to take us back to the beginning of your career. Of course, most would be familiar with your work from your days at the University of Oregon, and of course, more recently at the University of Connecticut, and of course, as the co-director of the National Center of Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. But can you take us back and just fill in the earlier part of the resume? Take us back to the period of time where you started your career and then to the point where you ended up at the University of Oregon.
Great question. And I think it's one that is important for each of us to pay attention to, because our early influences clearly shape, where we go and the kind of decisions we make and experiences we have. I'm going to do it a little bit differently because, like you just mentioned, I've been retired for a couple of years. And one of my interests in my retirement is to go back and look at some of my early influences. And one in particular I'd like to mention, just because of the times we're in, is that I have, over the last couple of years, been trying to visit all 10 of the internment camps where the Japanese Americans were interned during World War II. And the reason that's important to me is because my parents were interned. And as you're probably thinking, that internment experience of my parents influenced how they raised me. And that has shaped a lot of who I am. And part of my retirement has been to go back to explore that. And let me kind of explain how that's important. As a Japanese American, I am a third generation, which means I was born in California, as were my parents, but we were treated as non-citizens during World War II. And there are things happening nowadays that seem to mimic or copy or parallel some of those kinds of political decisions and actions that were happening. And going back and revisiting my early experiences has been pretty important to me, because it shapes a lot of how I view schools and families and communities, and how we treat each other, and how we look at differences, and how we appreciate the diversity that might be around us. So I wanted to mention that just because it has been so important to me in kind of seeing who I am now. Part of that experience shaped me into my first undergraduate career, which was at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Some of the listeners probably knew that I was a botany major at Santa Barbara. I was not in education. I was not in sociology. I was not in psychology. I was an old hippie, and I was really interested in environmental issues and sort of the humanistic part of what was happening during the Vietnam War. And I wanted to become a parks ranger, frankly, and I wanted to communicate with nature. And I became a botanist. Now, the reason that's important for two reasons. One is it taught me about the scientific method. It taught me about the importance of science in decision-making, and how do you test ideas? How do you confirm theory? And I mention that because that is what I carried into my later career in education, is this sort of scientific way of viewing questions and problems and issues. So I think that's important to remember, because not a lot of us in education have come up through these sort of the natural sciences.
Right.
The second reason I wanted to bring this up is because I took a job as the nature director in an Easter seal camp for children with disabilities in the Santa Cruz Mountains of California during the summer, just to make some money, to get out into the redwoods and so forth. Well, I ended up being a camp counselor in charge of 6 campers ages 16 through 52 who had disabilities. I had no idea how to push a wheelchair. I had no idea how to help somebody who needed to feed themselves and other things. But that experience immediately turned my head around, and I became very focused on disabilities. And I switched my career from botany to working in special education. And so those kind of early experiences, how my parents raised me, their experiences that shaped how they interact with me, and my initial experiences in the scientific kind of realm really shaped who and kind of decisions I made when I moved into education.
Yeah. And then where did the career start in education? Why? So special education, where did you begin your career sort of within the school system or as a classroom teacher? Where did that all begin?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I got my um, undergraduate degree in botany because my parents said, you got to get something that we paid for. You can't switch majors now. And so I
Mhm.
said, fine. And then I immediately went to the University of Washington and I got my teaching degree in special education there.
Yeah.
My vision was to become a high school science teacher and a
Mhm.
special ed teacher so I
Okay.
could take care of both of those things. Well, I became much more interested in kids with disabilities, in particular, kids with behavior problems, kids with
Mhm.
emotional disturbance. On campus, a recruiter came from some place called Aurora, Colorado, and I had no idea where that was.
Mhm.
I assumed it was up in the Rockies. I was going to be so excited about that, moving to the Rockies. Well, it turns out that Aurora is where Stapleton Airport used to be, which is where the current airport is now, out
Right.
in the plains of Colorado.
Yeah.
And in 1974, I took a job as a resource room teacher for kids with disabilities. I mentioned the year because that was the year of 94-142. That's when the first legislation became formalized in the United States to serve and meet the needs of kids with disabilities. So I had
Mhm.
the responsibility of setting up one of the first resource rooms for special education in Colorado. Had
Wow.
no idea how to do it. We wrote some of the first IEPs, had no idea how to do that. It was a phenomenal experience because the kids and the families with whom I worked with taught me what special ed was about. But I
Mhm.
also had to respond to these new laws that were out there.
Right.
I did that for 4 years and I decided that this is fine, but somehow I don't have the experience, I don't have the knowledge to actually do what really needs to be done. So I went back to the University of Washington and got my doctorate. And I wanted to become an administrator of school programs
Mhm.
because I thought that's where the influence is going to be. Well, I really got turned on to research and I
Mhm.
decided that I wanted to become a preparer of special ed teachers and I really wanted to do experimental research in special ed. And
Mhm.
that's when I took my first job at the University of Kentucky, which not many people know.
Mhm.
I worked there for about 4 years. Then I got an opportunity to work at the University of Oregon, which is what you mentioned earlier,
Right.
was my most, I guess, biggest kind of career change.
Mhm. So let's now talk about the center. Yes, right. So take us back to the beginning days, the early days of the Center for PBIS. Yourself, Rob Horner, others. Tell us about the genesis of the center and where how that all came about.
Right. So I started at the University of Oregon in 1984. And again, like many of the things I've done, I walked into it not knowing what it meant to work at a university. Um, but what I did learn is that there were some really smart people there. And I'm smart enough to know to kind of hang out with those kinds of people and learn from them, and create experiences and so forth. And I mention that in part because I think that has been part of my mode of operation throughout my career is working with people smarter than myself.
Mhm.
And I think that's one thing that all people in this profession should be thinking about because the field is rich with people that are smart.
Mhm.
Um, like I said, I started in 1984, but around 1990, 91 or so, I met this guy named Jeff Colvin. And Jeff
Mhm.
Colvin, as many of you know, probably listeners know, is a person from Australia who is brilliant at school-wide discipline and working with kids with behavior disorders. And he and I partnered up with Ed Kameanui, who is a reading guy, direct
Mhm.
instruction guy. And we decided that, we're not doing very good job if we just think about behavior management as one kid at a time. And we decided to look at school-wide discipline. And what we learned is much of school-wide discipline is reactive and punishing. And we said there's got to be a better way. And Ed and Jeff taught me that one of the best things you could do is teach rather than punish. Teach social skills, teach academics so kids experience success on the academic side, build their self-concepts and so forth. So the early years of Pbis started with something called Project Prepare. And Project Prepare was our early effort to do school-wide positive discipline. And then, as British Columbia knows, it turned into something called EBS, Effective Behavior Support, because some of our schools there wanted to become an EBS school. That they kind of named themselves. And so the project became EBS, and then I met people like yourself and Kathy Champion and Don Chapman and others, and we transferred EBS up to British Columbia. And as a result of that experience, we said, you know what, we could probably do this better in the United States as well. And we had a chance to apply for a grant. We applied for this grant called the Pbis grant. Fortunately, Rob Horner and I, who kind of wrote the initial grant with some others, got it. And that's where the center got started. I'll finish by just saying we had no idea what it meant to be a Pbis center. We just thought we were just going to do school-wide discipline. We just thought we were going to go out and do in-services to schools. But over time, we learned that that wasn't the best way to go. And I'll kind of address that as we go through the rest of the time.
Sure. Am I remembering correctly that you and I think you had told me once that the Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports was the name that you came up with because the grant application required a title or something? Am I remembering that correctly?
You are remembering it exactly right. And
yeah.
The interesting thing is when the United States Congress wrote the legislation for the funding of the grant, somebody called it the Pbis grant or the application, the Pbis application. I don't know who named it that. I don't know where it came from. It wasn't our decision. When we got the grant, we wanted to change the name, frankly, because Pbis was not a known set of terms. It was not familiar to educators. And we wanted to call it, EBS, or we wanted effective behavior support. We wanted to call it positive discipline, anything except Pbis. And but
and
by law, we had to call it that because that's what our funding was. That's what the Congress wanted. So that was 1996 or so that I got funded, and we kept the name. And fortunately, people like yourself and others around the United States and Canada made it successful. And Pbis created a life of its own. And that's how it became sort of a term that people identified with it.
Sure. Yeah. The EBS part, I still remember we were all schooled on the work and the forging of the new pathway by Fernridge Middle School and
that's
their
exactly
EBS efforts. And I think we can all remember that. Okay. So let's talk about Pbis now, because we know that Pbis has its roots in the behaviorist theory of psychology, but of course there are other theories out there. One that of course is quite prominent today is the constructivist theory of education or constructive theory of psychology, which surmises that students construct knowledge through their experiences. And we see that manifesting in project-based learning and inquiry-based learning approaches, et cetera. So here's where I want to go with this. How important do you think it is for the everyday classroom teacher or school administrator or school district to subscribe to a theory of psychology as they approach the work? Because I hear some educators, for example, proclaiming things like, I'm a constructivist teacher. Is that important to be grounded in a particular theory of psychology? Or do you think that actually might interfere with our ability to adapt to the complexities of learning and the complexities of behavioral support?
Right. So I'm going to answer broadly first and then get really narrow with your question. And go back to what we just talked about with Pbis. I think it's really important to understand at the beginning, and I'm going to say this throughout the discussion, is that Pbis is not a practice. It's not a theory. Pbis is really just a framework or a logic. It's a way of doing business. Now, having said that, though, I think it's important to know that the logic has a theoretical or conceptual foundation, and that comes out of the behavioral sciences. And I say that intentionally because Rob and I are behavior analysts, and we decided to build an approach that we could defend, that was theoretically defendable, meaning that there has been a tradition behind it. So the behavioral sciences has a long tradition, and it has a lot of manifestations and a lot of variations, and some things that people accept and some things people don't accept. But it has some fundamental principles that guide its implementation. And I say that because I want people to understand that 30 years later, Pbis is still a behaviorally based framework. And it's dangerous, I think, to try to say that it's something that it isn't, or try to modify it when the research hasn't been there to support that. So, having said that, I think it's really important for every educator to be able to define who they are with respect to their practice. And that is, as you just said, identify some theoretical framework that grounds their decisions, that grounds their actions. Now, what it's important to me is I'm perfectly fine with people picking a theory as long as it's defendable, meaning that there is a tradition, some empirical support for its basic fundamental rules, and so forth. I have chosen the behavioral sciences, behavioral theory, as my framework for doing business because I believe I can defend its basic framework. I can say what its advantages and disadvantages are and how it is the same and different from other theories. The constructivist theory and other theories, not just the constructivist, sometimes come in conflict with the behavioral theory because by definition, they're different.
Right.
And it's probably going to be always a case where there's an acceptance or unacceptance based on one's view of the world. If you're not a behaviorist, no problem, and you want to approach your solutions for classroom problems, for teaching, in a way that you feel is comfortable. I know that one thing you're going to ask me towards the end of this interview is what's most important to me. And I'm going to argue that one thing that's most important to me is the student benefiting from the decisions I make? If I can't document that the student isn't benefiting, then I'm not making good decisions.
Right.
One thing I like about the behavioral sciences, it gives me the tools that shortens the line between my decisions and student outcomes. Meaning I can say, if I do this, there's a great chance that this kid is going to be able to navigate his or her environment better. And I'm going to really try to shorten that line because student benefit is my primary goal. Right. I don't care if I'm working with the U.S. Department of Education secretary. When I make policy decisions with him or her, I'm going to say, I need to make sure I can draw a line between that decision and the student benefit. So to get very specific, you mentioned something about it's really important for students to construct their own knowledge, to construct their own kind of perceptions of their experiences. I absolutely agree with that. I think that makes sense. Kids need to be able to become good self-managers. They need to be able to make good decisions. One thing that the behavioral or the Pbis approach focuses on, however, is that kids need to be sometimes taught some of the fundamental tools to be able to navigate their environment, how to learn how to assess their environment, how to learn how to make decisions about what other people are doing, how to learn about what is disrespectful and respectful. And by learning those skills, they have experiences that shape who they become, how to shape their future decisions and behaviors and so forth. I think our approach to becoming self-actualized is a little different, meaning that we're tool-driven in the beginning, or we want to help kids learn how to organize their environment for success. I have 2 kids. I want them to become good self-managers. I want them to become independent, but I also want them to learn how to make good decisions that is not harmful to themselves, others, or the environment. And so I want to help make sure that they have experiences that help shape that kind of perspective. Right. That's a lot of words to say. Theory is important.
Yeah.
I'm but not trying to, yeah.
I wonder sometimes if sometimes we go too far. I guess I'm just trying to hypothesize that maybe we lock ourselves into a silo and aren't a little more malleable about the overlap between a lot of theories and practice.
Right.
I'm wondering too, George, just since you brought it up, are there theories out there from your perspective, and I'm legitimately curious about this, that from your perspective are not defendable?
Yes. I don't know that I could. I don't feel like I'm in a position to kind of name them. However, I think good theories have a strong empirical foundation. meaning that there's been tests or studies or research done to test the basic premises or basic fundamental rules. You mentioned something about positive reinforcement, about the impact of feedback, the impact of experiences. The behavioral literature is overflowing with studies that document how influential experiences are to learning. When we give corrective feedback in reading, when we tell somebody that that is wrong or incorrect, when we tell somebody, here is a better way, all that form of feedback has been experimentally been tested. And if it increases future performance, it's been labeled positive reinforcement.
Right.
I think where we get in trouble is when a counter theory or an opposing theory puts a value on that statement. Oh, positive reinforcement is bribery. Well, bribery actually is not in the vocabulary of the behavioral sciences. It is considered unethical to shape people to do behaviors that are illegal or inappropriate. Absolutely, so we're not going to argue with bribery as being good or bad. It's bad. But we're going to argue that what we're doing is not necessarily shaping illegal behavior.
Right. So we're going to definitely come back to that. I definitely want to take a deeper dive into that area of positive reinforcement and some of the misinformation and, quite frankly, a lot of the hyperbole that's out there in reference to that. But I want to shift a little bit here to. I tried to get you to name a theory, by the way. I was hoping, but I didn't think you'd take the bait. But I want to shift here to the three-tiered framework, and obviously we talk about the triangle that of course is fairly ubiquitous at this point, and I have two questions I want to explore with you. Whether you're coming at it from the angle of RTI or Pbis or MTSS, whatever approach or label that people use with it, we know that the triangle is typically emerges at that response rate of 80, 15, and 5. 80% tier 1, 15%, and those are just targets. It's not that it's locked in stone, but we know that that's kind of the response rate. So my first question is, where did the triangle come from, and how did we, and I'm using the royal we here, how did we figure out the 80, 15, and 5 designations for those tiers?
All right. Again, a great question, and one that we continually address and have addressed over the last 30 years, because it's like the first myth I told you before. Pbis is a practice. Well, it's not a practice, it's a framework. So the reason I mention that again is because the framework has some tenets that make it a viable framework. One of the tenets is prevention. We're all about kind of preventing the development of problem behaviors or preventing problem situations. We're in the business of preventing future problem behaviors from occurring again, once they've already started to occur. Now, where we started in 1992-ish or so, actually a little bit later, 1994, with Hill Walker's work and some others, is we learned that if prevention is going to be a viable principle, it needs to be something that it becomes tangible, something we can work with. So we stole from the public health literature the notion that prevention is a tiered logic. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the public health literature, it basically says we need to organize the world so that everybody can be healthy, successful, safe. And that everybody is the royal everybody. It's kind of like, how do you prevent heart disease? Well, you can prevent heart disease by eating well, exercising, dieting, getting good sleep. That's tier 1. That's universal. That's what we want to promote. But there are some of us who need a little bit of extra in order to prevent heart disease. We don't exercise as much as we should. We sometimes don't get enough sleep on a regular basis, and so forth and so on. So we might need to have a little bit of coaching, and we might need to have some peer support. That's tier 2. That's a little bit more intensive support. And there are some of us who, because of the bad luck of the draw, because of our lifestyles, whatever, have risk features. We might have diabetes. We might have heart disease. We might. And those increase the risks of heart attacks and so forth. So what we need to do then is come up with more intensive more individualized treatments, medications, and so forth. That's tier 3. Now, we said that logic that makes great sense. Why can't we apply that to the social sciences, i.e. education? So Hill Walker and his colleagues said, when you're working with kids with emotional disturbance, they need to have an environment that is positive, caring, and safe, tier 1. We need to treat all kids with behavior disorders, with respect and teach them about responsibility. Some of those kids, in order to navigate their environments, need something extra. So we're going to provide them with some small group counseling. We're going to provide them with some peer-based mentoring. We're going to provide them with some tier 2, more intensive. And some of those kids, like Tom, he's going to need an individualized plan that's unique to him, because his behaviors require some high intensity, high frequency, high dosage experience, tier 3. Hill Walker said, if we're going to work with kids with behavior disorders, we can't just do tier 3 with them. We have to do tier 2 and tier 1 with them. They need to create a total experience that's positive and preventative. So then Jeff and I and Rob, we stole that from Hill, who stole that from the public health literature.
Right.
And we said, let's create school environments like that, where everybody, all 400 kids in a school, all 1,500 kids in a secondary school, all those kids experience a positive, safe, a respectful environment. Some of those kids moving around that environment are going to need a little extra reminders. And then there's always Tom, who's in that third period class. He's going to need an individualized behavior contract.
Yeah.
But let's organize our practices, our interventions around that tiered logic. Now, a couple more things, and I'll stop yapping away here.
No.
And that is, the 3-tiered logic is only a logic. You could have 4 tiers. You could have 7 tiers. You could have, whatever. What's important is that we think about it as a continuum of experiences.
Right.
So let me give you a very concrete, important example. Recently, there's been some work being done focusing on the impact of positive greetings at the door. We actually have really good research now showing that if teachers greet their kids at the classroom door, you can have a big impact on reducing problem behaviors in the classroom and increasing academic engagement when the first direction is being given. Positive greeting at the door is a universal intervention. Good morning, Tom. Good to see you. Don't forget to hang up your backpack. It can also be used for tier 2. Good morning, Tom. Good to see you. Don't forget to hang up your backpack. And by the way, Jane here is going to accompany you to your seat to show you where to put your lunch. I've got a tier 2 intervention in place now. Then I might have, Tom, don't forget to check off on your self-management card that you got to class on time. Those are 2 tier 2 interventions being applied at the greeting at the door.
Right.
And then there's Tom walking in the classroom, who I say to Tom, hey, Tom, why don't you please go down to the counselor first before you enter the classroom? Because the counselor has an important message to give you before you start your work. And that message is a cool off because you look a little tense to me. That's a tier 3 intervention being applied at the door. Now, in that example, I've done all 3 tiers at the door for all 30 kids, but I've also applied a tier 2 and a tier 3 intervention. It's a continuum. It's something that you intensify based on how the kid walks in the door. It's how the kids walk in the school door. It's how the teachers experience the classroom.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to think about this as sort of dynamic and as a logic, and it's prevention oriented. The misrule is we label kids. Oh, Tom is a tier 3 kid.
Right.
Wrong. Tier 3, Tom is not a tier 3 kid. He has a couple tier 3 needs, but he also needs to experience what it means to be respectful in the hallway.
Yeah. I love that idea of experiences and the idea of looking at the tiers through those experiences. You bring up public health and the 3 tiers of public health. It's interesting, knowing that background, to look at how the pandemic has been managed and handled through that lens, and the idea of prevention and preventing new cases from emerging, and really applying that 3-tiered logic to what's happening through the pandemic actually does bring quite a bit of clarity in terms of how public health agencies are approaching or have approached health. When you think about the 3-tiered logic, though, the triangle, if you will, what are some aspects of that triangle that you think educators continue to either misinterpret or misunderstand?
Right. Well, one of them I just already mentioned to you, which is
Yeah.
that labeling kids or labeling individuals.
Right.
And I just want to elaborate a little bit about that. I just want you to think that I want the listeners, viewers, to remember that all of us have a tiered set of needs.
Hmm.
Um, when I visited Jamaica, people there were speaking patois. I had no idea what they were saying. I needed a translator to be standing next to me. I needed tier 3 supports for translating patois.
Right.
Um, in my research group, I know what it means when you say that there's a probability of significance, score. I would not know how to calculate that. I have a group of researchers who I fortunately get to work with who help me learn how to do those statistics. So I have some tier 2 needs in my own work. I think all of us have a set of needs and a set of experiences and practices. Going to the pandemic question, that's really an interesting one because, vaccinations and so forth, testing, that's basically a tier 1 set of strategies, making it available to everyone, publicizing it and so forth. I don't know that in the United States we've done a very good job with tier 2 and tier 3, however. There are individuals who might need a little bit of extra help to get access to vaccinations in their neighborhood because they don't have transportation, they don't have the financial, whatever. They don't have it as part of their peer group as being, prompted or coached. There's some people who actually oppose vaccinations and so forth. And the kinds of supports that are needed to help them join or participate in the prevention strategies there becomes much more intense.
Right.
So I think we understand that there's a need for tier 2, tier 3 supports in a variety of different areas, not just in vaccinations and
Right.
pandemic. But I don't know that we always put those interventions in place. And I mention that because I don't know we do that in education very well either.
Mhm.
We put in place, um, a lot of schools will come to us and say, we want PBIS in our schools. We need help with Tom. And they're really asking for tier 3 supports for Tom, when in fact, they don't have a good foundation for doing that delivery of tier 3 to Tom because tier
Right.
1 is not in place.
Right.
So that's a long way of saying one of the troubles with the tier 3 tiered logic is jumping only to individual tiers and not thinking about the total continuum
Yeah.
across. I want to go to one more point, which I forgot to address, then I'll stop again. And that is, you mentioned the 80, 15, and 5. I forgot to mention that that is also part of the prevention public health logic.
Okay.
Basically says that if 80% of the population is doing okay, we're probably doing okay with our tier 1 universal interventions. That's also, if you think about the pandemic response, there's quite a bit of comment from the scientists out there saying that if we can get 75 to 80% of our population vaccinated, we might have a jump start in future, cases. That's where that 80, 15, and 5 kind of falls in place. It's a sort of a
Hmm.
target or a goal. It might vary by problem how you differentiate that criteria. It could be 60, 30, and 10 based
Right.
on what you're trying to address. But
Right.
for the most part, the 80, 15, and 5 serves as a good set of milestones or guideposts for us to follow.
Mhm. I remember back in the early days of my own training and learning from you that one of the breakthroughs for me with the triangle was that idea of those experiences happening and being varied throughout the day, that I might only need tier 1 supports in one of my classes. That was a real breakthrough for me because I certainly, and I think this is typical in the early days of learning, you kind of silo students. Even though we know we're not supposed to label them, it's hard not to, as you think about a student needs tier 2 supports, therefore they need tier 2 supports in all settings, all day,
Right,
all the time.
right,
And the idea of being that it fluctuates, that you literally, I remember you showing a triangle and there were little graphs that kind of went up and down saying that in physical education I need tier 3 supports, but in English language arts I might only need tier 1 supports, and things like that. That was a real breakthrough for me. And I think it helps understand that this is a continuum of experience that fluctuates throughout the day based on setting, based on need,
right.
and where the student is, certainly.
Yeah. I want to
Um,
restate two things in that comment. One is that you're absolutely right about how we have not differentiated. But in the academic world, we've actually done that.
Yeah.
If you think about reading, George may have difficulty reading, so he might need some extra reading practice and even some individual tutoring. But in math, I don't need it, right? So I benefit from the tier 1 instruction. The second point is, which you also kind of reiterated, and that is, if you think about kids' behavioral profiles, I'm pretty good about self-managing my own behaviors, but I'm pretty clumsy when it comes to interacting with others, especially in non-structured settings like hallways. So I might need some supports in the hallways for my social interactions. I don't need tier 3 supports in the hallways for my independence, because I can get to my class on my own. I can get to my locker on my own. But when I have to interact with somebody else in the hallway, I get clumsy, I get embarrassed, and I tease because I think teasing is a way to get attention. And that isn't the way to get attention the right way. And so I mess up and I get in fights and so forth and so on. So your points are really important. And I think it kind of reinforces the idea that we have this misrule that academic behaviors are different than social behaviors. Well, the truth is, skills and behaviors, they're just skills and behaviors.
Right.
They're things we do, they're things we'll learn. And there's nothing mystical about my cooperative play and my ability to read. They're all being shaped by the experiences I have in my instruction and by my interactions with others.
Two thoughts came to mind as you were responding there. The first being, it just illustrates how labor intensive tier 3 supports can be for educators because of the finite and levels or granularity that we have to get to in terms of identifying the different settings, the different experiences, all of the different triggers that occur, and that investment in a foundation and universal supports in tier 1 and tier 2 really making the case for, I guess, figuratively trying to pull kids down the triangle, because it is certainly more efficient at each of the tiers there. To me, that really speaks to the importance of investment as opposed to trying to jump to tier 3. And the other piece that comes to mind is this, again, it illustrates the hurdle that sometimes many of us have. I'm using the royal us because I don't think you and I have this, but the idea that when it's academic, we seem to not have an issue with differentiating between classrooms and academic subject areas. But as soon as it's behavioral, for some reason, there is this hurdle. And that leads me to the next question. And as we finish up here in part 1, it's this link between academics and student behavior. And you were just alluding to that. And I think that we know that rather than seeing them as silos, we know that link has been long established between, in academia. We know that link between academics and behavioral support has been clear, that when students reach high rates of academic success, challenging behaviors, antisocial behaviors tend to be low. And when academic success is low, challenging antisocial behaviors tend to be high. We know it's not causal, but we certainly know that reciprocal relationship has been there for decades. So what specifically does the research tell us about why that correlation is so strong? Where is that sort of link? And sort of get into some of the specifics, maybe, George, about the connection between the two.
Right. I think one way to think about it is, one way that I sort of address that question, is that I think it's important to remember that learning and teaching doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs in a social context. So, I think about what I've learned from people like yourself and others in British Columbia about what Pbis looks like in British Columbia. Well, that's because you and I engaged each other. It's because you and I spent time together. It's because you and I organized opportunities for us to sit down and talk through or whatever. Learning about something academic requires that there be some social, environmental structures in place that allow that instruction to happen. You can't teach somebody how to read if they're not attending to what you're presenting. You can't teach somebody to read if they don't get feedback about what they're doing right and wrong. You can't teach somebody to read when they're teasing or bullying a neighbor. You can't, so forth and so on. So it's really important, I think, to understand that the association that you described is probably tied to the importance of one thing influencing the other. As you said, if kids are learning to read successfully, they're much more, their self-concepts are better, their perceptions about their capacity to learn more is higher,
Mhm.
and they start interacting with others more positively. And that spins that circle around of having more positive socials, you know? And so I think it's really important not to separate the two, but understand how one is in fact bolstering the other. And you really can't have good learning unless you have good social environments or good social engagements to make that happen. I'll always remember at the University of Washington when I was taught how to teach reading, we spent more time on arranging the environment to get ready to read or teach reading than we did on the actual curriculum, because the curriculum's easy. It's
Mhm.
getting the kids organized in the right kind of circle. It's getting the materials set up in a way that's accessible. It's making sure that the teacher has a positive relationship with the student, and so forth and so on. That set of prerequisites enables the instruction to become much more efficient and much more effective. So I think,
Mhm.
it's important to kind of think about those two together. The other thing I want to kind of quickly mention is that sometimes gets in the way is how we inappropriately treat academic and behavioral errors. When a kid makes an academic error, we oftentimes will say, and as we should say, well, let me teach you. Let me show you another way. Let me give you some more practice. We
Mhm.
actually take responsibility for kids' failures or inabilities to learn an academic or to make when they make a mistake. On the
Mhm.
social behavior side, when Tom blurts out a profanity, we immediately say, Tom, you stop that. That is inappropriate. And we blame it on the student.
Mhm.
Yes, that behavior is unacceptable. Absolutely right. It's socially inappropriate. At the same time, we have to ask ourselves, can we help Tom learn a better way of expressing his frustration?
Mhm.
Can we teach Tom a better way of saying, I don't like being teased? Can we teach Tom another way of saying this work's too hard? Can we actually set it up so he doesn't experience failure with that work, so he doesn't have to use those words to express his frustrations? We don't analyze it from a environmental perspective. We focus on blame, which is part of what reinforces the split between the academic and behavioral kind
Mhm.
of instruction.
Would you then say that it is favorable practice to ensure that all IEPs have both a behavioral and a set of academic goals? Would you say that academic challenges should also be accompanied with behavioral goals, and behaviorally based IEPs would have academic goals attached to them? Would you subscribe to that sort of
Yeah.
purposeful mix?
So let me respond in two ways. One is that each of us, all kids in classrooms, all of us that are learners, are probably going to have both academic and or behavioral needs. Some of them are going to be more intense than others. Uh, Tom is really fortunate. He doesn't have a whole lot of academic needs, but he has a few social. So I don't know that everybody has to have both.
Okay.
However, and I think, well, and not however, if you have a disability, one of the hallmarks of special education is being able to identify the individualized needs of that learner. So here's George. George has had some difficulties getting along with others. He's been identified as having some social and emotional disorders. Okay, it's pretty clear that he's going to have some behavioral goals and objectives that have to be addressed. Whether I need or not I need academic specific goals is going to be based on whether or not I'm having trouble in academics.
Hmm.
It could be that I'm having a little bit of trouble in reading because my behavior stuff's getting in the way. So what I probably might need is some tier 2 supports for my academics to support my tier 3 objectives and goals, but I still may not need an objective.
Hmm.
But I really want people to remember that because George has some behavioral and academic some social and behavioral goals, he still needs to have good instruction regardless.
Right.
Tier 1, right?
Yeah.
Because George has emotional disturbance does not mean that he doesn't get access to good instruction that all kids are getting access to. There is this overgeneralized misrule about, oh, he's emotionally disturbed, he can't read. He actually reads really well.
Hmm.
He just can't get access to reading instruction because of his behavior challenges. So it's important to not overgeneralize the problems.
Right.
I think you're
Make sure.
absolutely right about that.
Yeah, to make sure that we continually force that overlap or that Venn diagram between the two instead of creating
Right,
those
right.
silos. Okay, George, last question for today as we finish up part one. And of course, listeners will have part two with George next week. Last question today. It's a question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast, and you can take this in any direction you wish. And I know that you're retired, but I know education is still in your blood. So I'm going to ask you this question, and you take it where you want to go. Educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night which is kind of an interesting thing because it's something I didn't think about when we first started the Pbis Center, but became very important to us 3 or 4 years into the effort. And so what keeps me up at night is our sometimes failure to pay attention to the accuracy of our implementation of an evidence-based practice. Now, I say those things intentionally. Evidence-based meaning that I have some faith that it's going to work, and implementation fidelity meaning, am I doing it accurately? Mm-hmm. Is the kid really going to experience how it's been designed to be implemented? I think one thing that you brought up earlier is we sometimes provide a kid with a tier 3 intervention, but we don't do it long enough, intensely enough, as the instruction book dictates. We just do it, okay, you had it this morning, therefore you're going to be okay the rest of the day. Mm-hmm. And that's a failure to follow the guidelines that we would say is really important for implementation fidelity. So what keeps me up at night now is, I've been out of the scene for 2.5 years. I worry about whether or not people are doing Pbis with fidelity, that the framework and all its guiding principles and the practices that we have defined as being important to the continuum, that the systems that we've put in place, the teams, the administrative support, the coaching, all those elements are being included in the implementation. Because if we just do a 45-minute in-service on Pbis and we say, go forth and do it, we're going to fail. Mm-hmm. One thing we learned in British Columbia from the work that you and others had done in the implementation there was the importance of coaching and the importance of coaching of teams, not just coaching of staff. It's getting the teams up to speed so they can implement with fidelity with their staff. So implementation fidelity becomes such a key one. One last comment about what keeps me up at night. This has to do with the last 8, 10, 12 years or so of what's been happening. And that is our failure to tweak our implementation based on the cultural and contextual fit of the intervention. I know, for example, in British Columbia that we've done Pbis pretty well. We implemented with some pretty good fidelity. But I've also learned that in British Columbia and other places that we've not accommodated First Nations culture very well. The language, their families, their communities, and the kinds of experiences they bring to school. We've not done it very well in Australia with the Aboriginal culture. We've not done it very well with the Native Americans in the United States. We've not done it very well with kids of color. We've not done it very well with kids who come in from backgrounds that are different or poor. We've not done an implementation tweaking with kids who come in who have migrated or immigrated to the country. We've actually punished some of those differences as opposed to including them. So I think one thing that's important about implementation fidelity is to know that we might have to tweak it for a secondary setting versus a preschool setting. We might have to tweak it for a more wealthy environment in Vancouver than a more impoverished area. We might have to tweak it where the languages are different. There might be 2 languages versus 12 languages being spoken. So I think implementation fidelity is being sensitive to the cultural and contextual fit as well. Some of the disproportionality and inequities and injustices we're seeing in our schools now is because of our failure to tweak what we know can work with what we're doing. So let me conclude by saying what keeps me up at night is our failure to implement and evidence-based practices. And the the easy way of thinking about this is, are you, Tom, willing to bet your next month's salary on the decision you made about the practice and the implementation you did today on the impact on student benefit? If you're not willing to bet your next month's salary on student benefit from what you just did, then you got to go back and think about, is this the right practice and I'm implementing correctly? Because if you're not willing to bet your next month's salary, that doesn't give me enough confidence in your implementation.
Okay, I want to pivot now to some specific, maybe even some controversial issues that always seem to come up when talking about PBIS. And I know last week, George, you mentioned the idea of positive reinforcement and some of the ways that that gets misunderstood. So I want to start with that and this debate between extrinsic and intrinsic reinforcement or rewards. I know it's a complex topic, and I know there can be a lot of hyperbole out there within the debate. Many seem to be so fearful of utilizing any external response or reinforcement or reward for pro-social behavior because in their eyes, it might lead to a diminished sense of intrinsic motivation. The use of gotchas, if you will, or the tickets as people refer to them or something like that, of course, is a very polarizing part of PBIS. So from your perspective, George, what is the healthiest, most balanced mindset educators can have when it comes to this idea of extrinsic versus intrinsic, that whole debate around motivation?
Right. So let me back up and just say, thanks for inviting me back for part two. I guess I did okay on part one.
Absolutely.
It also gives me a chance to, correct anything I might have made a mistake about on the previous part one. So thanks for having me back again.
Yeah.
Great question. And again, I think I mentioned some of this generally in trying to respond to this intrinsic versus extrinsic. As I like to do, I like to speak broadly and then kind of narrow down a little bit. Mm-hmm. I think it's really important to ask the question about what is the outcome we want to achieve, or what is the benefit we want the student to experience? What is it that we want kids to be able to learn, to be able to do, and so forth? I'm all about kids becoming independent thinkers. I'm all about kids becoming independent in their decision making and how they navigate their environments. I think we can agree, that that's an important set of outcomes for people to be good thinkers and so forth. I think where we might have some disagreement or some rough edges, if you will, is how we get there, and what that might look like, and the assumptions we make about how we get there. Because I think assumptions is an important descriptor, because the intrinsic discussion or debate, if you will, controversy, whatever you want to call that, is about assumptions. It's about things we assume are important or not important or dangerous or safe or what have you. So let me start out by reiterating that I come from this behavioral sciences perspective. And I think it's really important that teaching and learning be thought about in the context of the environment in which that is occurring, and that each individual who comes to that setting comes with a learning history, comes with a biological makeup, comes with a sort of set of physical characteristics and so forth. Those are sort of givens. What goes on inside the person is really hard for me because it's hard to see. So we have to trust what the person says and what the person does to be able to understand what's going on inside the person. So I'm looking at you, Tom, and I'm making these assumptions about what you're thinking based on how you're looking at me and how you're nodding and so forth and so on. And whether or not there's any validity to those things, I have to depend upon what you tell me you say you're thinking and what, and so forth and so on. I think when I think about kids, I think the same thing has to be put in place. I think we can infer what they're thinking. We can infer how they're navigating their, internal lives and so forth. But we have to trust what they're saying, and we have to trust what they do as a window to that internal world. And so I really kind of depend upon what kids say and what they do as being my first line of action. If Tom swears at me, I'm going to infer something about what he's thinking, but I'm also going to say, how should I respond to that? And maybe what should Tom say instead? So to kind of get specific, but probably dance around the answer, is I'm not sure the intrinsic extrinsic discussion does help me much in understanding what I'm going to do with Tom. I'm going to ask Tom, I'm going to interview him, I'm going to watch him, I'm going to assess what he does and what he doesn't do, and I'm going to work with Tom and his family and his peers to develop the best environment possible so he can be successful. To me, the best indicator of intrinsic motivation success is when Tom is a good self-manager. He can make good decisions based on what information he has available. He interacts favorably, positively, and respectfully with others, kids and adults. He makes good, healthy decisions that are safe for himself. He manages his learning environment so that he can learn and promote his future learning. He knows how to verbally communicate his feelings in ways that are understandable to others, and he does actions that reflect good strategies for dealing with those emotions. So, there's no way that I'm going to deny that emotions don't exist, because I know they exist. There's no way I'm going to deny that you and I think, and so forth. But what I'm going to really depend upon is what you say and what you do to reflect those feelings and what you're thinking. Absolutely the same thing is true of kids. And there's no way we're going to ask kids to become automatons, to become compliant without questioning, because questioning is a good thing. Being a responsible learner is questioning, what you do and what you see other people doing, but questioning it in a way that is pro-social and is not harmful to others. So I think, I think there's more agreement than disagreement about the extrinsic and intrinsic. I think there's disagreement on some of the discussions on the fringe, or as you said, some of the hyperbole that's out there.
Right.
And that we sometimes come at it from counter theoretical models, which sometimes gets in the way.
Yeah. I guess the question really centers on the idea of evidence, and does the evidence support some of the assertions that external reinforcement, external reward, if you will, diminishes intrinsic motivation? I always find it interesting, and I think I'm remembering an article by John Magg from back in the early 2000s where he talked about, when it comes to positive reinforcement, people worry that external will diminish intrinsic. And yet when it comes to consequences for antisocial behavior or misbehavior in schools, people don't seem to have a problem with external consequences diminishing intrinsic motivation. I think there was something to that effect of that
Absolutely
idea.
right.
So where does the research land on that issue around?
Yes.
Because I think there's a lot of conversation out there. There's a lot of assertions made in the public space. But what does the research tell us about the connection between external and intrinsic motivation?
Right. There have been a number of what are called meta-analyses done, where you collect all the research around a specific topic and figure out what the general consensus is of that literature. And in general, those meta-analyses say that it's very little evidence to suggest that providing external feedback and so forth and so on can cause damage to, quote, intrinsic motivation, whatever that might be.
Right.
So there's that question, of course, again.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are some theorists whose theoretical models challenge that interpretation of those meta-analyses.
Okay.
So that's out there. It's not a large population of researchers, but there's some theorists out there who say that meta-analysis interpretation is wrong, just based on their theoretical model. But the majority of that empirical research suggests that you can't damage intrinsic motivation by providing external feedback. It does provide some warnings, however, that says that if the only thing you do and the only thing you assume is that giving a kid a tangible is going to change his or her behaviors, we're in trouble.
Right.
Because that is not what that literature says. The literature says that using tangibles as a vehicle for providing feedback is a good way of helping kids learn, helping kids navigate their environments. A couple comments about the Pbis world. Yes, indeed, we use tangibles sometimes to build school-wide classroom systems to provide feedback to kids. In the beginning of Pbis, we tried not to do that because we didn't want tangibles to become the tools for building school-wide systems. However, this always gets me in trouble, but however, what we found is the adults were not very good about providing feedback on a regular, continuous basis. we'd say, you know what, all we want you to do is give kids feedback about what they're doing right. Verbal feedback, praise statements, smiles, eye contact, whatever. You know, give them some social positives and let them know that you appreciate them for what they're doing. The adults were terrible at doing that in general. Not all adults, but not anybody listening or watching this podcast, but all the others.
Nice save, George.
Many of our teams,
Yeah.
our teams came up with the idea that we need to give reminders to the staff members. So they came up with one of the initial positives were gotchas.
Yeah.
You know, and high fives from Fern Ridge, as you know, and the pro tickets. Those were invented by teams who said, let's give these to the adults to hold, to remind them to give out positives to kids. Yeah. But they always warned that if you give a kid a gotcha, it has to be accompanied by a verbal praise statement and an honest social positive expression. Nice job, right. Tom. I appreciate so, you know, it can't be just give it out and walk away. And you have to label what they did. Nice job, Tom. I really appreciate the way you walked away from that difficult situation. I just want to give you this good citizen ticket because you were being a good citizen. Right. It's that verbal social contact that matters. Those tokens carry no value except what you give when you provide provide when you give the ticket. They're tools. That's all they are. They're tickets to get access to something else.
I think that would surprise some people to learn that the tickets, tokens, gotchas, et cetera, were actually invented by the teachers, by the teams that decided they need to remind the adults. That was a massive breakthrough for me as well, George, in the early days, was understanding that that was all designed to make sure that adults were regular and predictable with their feedback for on-task pro-social behavior, and that the adults we honestly are not very good at that. And it's also interesting in this conversation, I think you mentioned this last week about feedback in sort of the world that I work in now in assessment and grading. We talk a lot about how important descriptive feedback is in terms of advancing academic learning, which by definition would be an external. And it's interesting that externally sourced academic feedback doesn't seem to bring the same heaviness in terms of diminishing intrinsic motivation. If we subscribe to the theory external diminishes intrinsic, wouldn't we worry that teacher-based or teacher-centered feedback on academic learning would diminish the student's intrinsic motivation to keep learning? We never talk about that. And so it seems to be this very narrow piece around behavior, which does carry with it some of those, some of that baggage that we talked about last week in terms of when it's a behavioral-based thing. You talked about how when it's academic, we teach; when it's behavioral, we consequence. It is an interesting conversation to have in terms of those different ideas.
Yeah, and if I can just interrupt for a second, I think it's important to understand that some of the controversy is associated with, as I mentioned last time at the end of the podcast, a poor implementation. Mm-hmm. So we see teachers going around giving out a thing, but not saying anything. We see, and the kids saying, "What's that for?" Right? And we have situations where a teacher will say, "If you don't do this, I won't give you."
Right.
You know, those are misrules on how to use a token. You know, and so those misrules create these criticisms of the use of a token. I also want to mention that if you were to go back and look at the literature on token economies in the behavioral literature, there's an incredible evidence base out there for the successful use and impact of tokens for improving social environments, improving academic skills, improving social interactions, et cetera, not just for kids with disabilities, but all kids. But those are examples of it being used the right way as opposed to being used inappropriately. So one of the things I like to do whenever I hear a myth, which sometimes not sometimes, which you've been presenting to me, is go back and find out what's the source of that myth. Well, it's oftentimes a misapplication, of a given procedure or practice or what have you, because you can't blame the practice if we fail to do it the correct way, and frankly, it's my fault for not having taught the user of the token to use it the right way.
Right.
It's my fault for not having the teams and coaches in the schools remind the staff to do it the right way. So,
Hmm.
it's pretty fascinating kind of thing to see. One other thing I'd really like the listeners or viewers to do is to ask a kid, you know, why they receive a token.
Hmm.
And if a kid says, oh, that's just the teacher's way of telling me I did something the right way, then I think I'm pretty okay with that. If a kid says the teacher gave me this, so I will do it again in the future, then I'm in trouble because the
Hmm.
kid's working for the token and the teacher is reinforcing that idea.
Right.
The kids will tell us. Most secondary kids are going to say, oh, that's the teacher's gimmick. They're just trying to. I'm
Yeah.
okay with that as long as they understand that it's the teacher trying to give feedback for being more respectful, with each other. So I think it's kids can be one of the best
Hmm.
thermometers for telling us whether or not something's being used appropriately, whether or not it needs to continue. One of the misrules is using it too long. You can stop after a while. You don't need to keep giving out these tokens
Right.
because the kids are going to have a relationship with you that's built around positives.
Right. I think those implementation errors are really important to pay attention to. The caricature of students walking down the right side of the hallway with their hands out waiting for their tokens and tickets. Those implementation errors really do, and they should be criticized. They really should. They should be
Absolutely.
critiqued, and we should take them to task on that type of it just feels as if you're not paying attention to the details in your implementation plan, and that's not the idea's fault. That's our fault for not implementing the right way. And I think you're
Right.
absolutely right also about secondary schools, because it really is about the reinforcement. It's really about not the reward or the tangible. It's really about the social interaction between the adult and the feedback that they are providing to the student. And as you said last week, and you've said again today, this idea that students become self-managers, they become self-regulatory, that they are able to go long stretches without that adult interaction. Is that not what defines a tier 1 student, is that they can go long stretches without that kind of interaction from an adult and they still act in a pro-social way?
Right.
That's how we
Absolutely.
define it. Yeah.
A successful quote tier 1 kid is excuse me, that's the wrong way to say it. A kid
Yeah.
has experienced successful tier 1 practices is a kid who can self-reinforce, if you will, can
Hmm.
say to myself, you know what, I got out of that situation the right way. I got out, and my friend was no longer embarrassed. A person who can identify and makes positive self-statements, cool. A kid who can walk down the hallway and say, hey, thank you very much for helping me, and is actually kind of helping another kid do it the right way.
Hmm.
Those are all, to me, the outcome of having experiences between the adult and the kid. you
Right.
know I don't think there's such a thing as a kid or an individual who can go long, long, long periods of time without reinforcement. I think
Right.
there are kids who have substitute other ways of giving themselves feedback about what they've been doing, or to arrange their environment to get feedback for success.
Right.
You know, it's like learning to play an instrument. When you play the right chord and it sounds right, you're getting feedback,
Mhm.
about having done it the right way, and you're going to keep doing it that way. Stop doing that incorrect, hand position. It's about um, identifying, in yourself or in your environment, what's going on,
Mhm.
and what's happening.
So the big message here, listeners, is if you are in a school that's implementing PBIS systems and supports, and you are engaged in regular reinforcement using any kind of token, re-examine your system and make sure that we're implementing the right way. Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about school discipline now, because as we know, as much as we teach students pro-social behaviors, we teach them pro-social skills, there are always those students who break the rules and end up in the office or end up being suspended or even some kind of other consequences for their action. We also know, and actually heard you reiterate this on a C-SPAN video that I watched when you were speaking at the White House, that both students who require special services and students of color are disproportionately disciplined at much higher rates. So I guess my question really is twofold. First, how do we prevent that kind of bias in terms of our school-wide discipline systems? How do we prevent that type of bias from entering our school-wide discipline procedures, if you will? And two, how do we ensure a structured, disciplined learning environment without relying on punitive measures? I know that's a question a lot of folks have. So if not consequences, if not those punitive measures, how do we structure that?
Right. So first of all, I think it's really important that we have a school-wide system in place that helps people understand what's okay and what's not okay, right? We have rules about what's
Mhm.
okay and not okay. And I think what we've gotten in a bad habit of doing is focusing on the misrules, the wrong things people do, as opposed to saying what are the right things we should be doing.
Mhm.
It's school-wide discipline. So we say no fights, right? And you're right, fights are unacceptable, inappropriate, especially physical fights, especially when people get hurt. We might argue that, at the school-wide level, we want to talk about asking, well, what can we do to solve problems more responsibly? What can we do to express our emotions more appropriately? We might want to build in some positive counter alternative rules that create a balance between the
Mhm.
negatives and the positives. You know, I think it's important that we have systems in place that remind kids and adults what they should and shouldn't do, but we need to balance that out with what are those more pro-social rules that have the same function, if you will, the same level of priority. We have become a culture in which punishment is our primary disciplinary policy. And that has gotten us in trouble because it focuses all our attention on what people do incorrectly.
Mhm.
Now, there's a lot of baggage attached to that statement, meaning that when you have communities, cultures, environments where you have kids coming in with a variety of learning environments, a variety of cultural experiences, a variety of street behaviors, if you will, that are counter to those rules that are established, both inferred as well as more explicit, we tend to up the ante on the consequences to try to get kids to comply.
Mhm.
The misrule there, I think, is we fail to up the ante on the positives that have to occur. So if I knew that a given culture is one where they come in using inappropriate language as the primary response to being bullied, I'm going to try to cut that off at the pass early. Acknowledge that, yes, on the street, you might use profanity when you are bullied. In school, here's how we respond. And I might try to tier two-ishly increase the instruction for that particular skill. So it's understanding what kids come to the school with and understanding how much of a habit that experience has been
Mhm.
kind of dictates what my school-wide instruction has to be. I think we have to up the ante on tier two, tier three positives as opposed to upping the ante on tier two, tier three negatives for kids who come in with different learning experiences.
Mhm.
I also want to acknowledge that the adults have to come to grips individually with some of their learning experience is, because I know that, for example, in certain cultures, kids are taught this is how we deal with bad behavior in our homes.
Mhm.
It's isolation, it's physical punishment, it's whatever those things are. And as a teacher, as a school administrator, I might carry that learning history with me. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad for a given culture. What I am saying, though, is that for a large community like a school or classroom, we want to promote more positive kind of environments because those environments can be more supportive of our academic and our kind of social missions. But it's important to understand what our individual learning histories are and how that might prejudice our decisions on what we do.
Mhm.
That's one of the reasons why PBS has been so focused on team-based implementations so that we have a community of people making decisions about what's being implemented.
Mhm.
One of our struggles has always been, well, what happens when a school principal, what happens when Mr. Schimmer, the principal, you know, has a perspective that punishment is his or her primary tool? Then we have a bigger challenge in front of us with respect to district-wide policies and implementation. Um, I just realized I don't know if I'm answering your question or not,
Yeah, just finish
but
your thought.
all right. But school discipline has become a very difficult thing to change because the habit is to increase the focus on punishment. I think the thing we got to promote is understanding where kids are coming from, especially cultures of kids,
Right.
and upping the ante on the pro-social side as a way of responding.
Yeah.
I would love, as I know you've used yourself, a school that has office discipline referrals as one tool, but also has a positive discipline referral as a second tool.
Right.
And giving the staff the challenge of giving out more positive discipline referrals than negative ones
Yeah.
to change the culture of the school discipline system.
Yeah, that is certainly something in schools I've worked in for sure. We've tried to promote. It's a challenge though because we know that we just have a disproportionate amount of attention and response to negative behaviors. We tend to respond more intensely. We tend to respond more acutely. We tend to respond overall more frequently to negative behavior. So it really does take that work and that effort. I want to bring you back to part of the question, which was about culture. I'm thinking about and help us navigate through this in our current context, thinking about being racially equitable, thinking about being culturally responsive. When we talk about the expectations within a school, we know that one of the foundations is 3 to 5 positively stated expectations and those behavioral examples that help teach students what those things look like. How do we start to make sure that how we define appropriate pro-social behavior isn't just narrowly defined through a sort of white Eurocentric lens? How do we make sure that there is the term I often use is culturally expansive and inclusive idea that what is appropriate behavior for our school is culturally inclusive? How do we go about that work?
Right. The general answer is it's really going to become important for the school community as a whole. That means families, community members, possibly staff, kids, etc. That the school community as a whole participate in the development of those expectations. Because without the voice of students, without the voice of families, without the voice of community, we're in trouble. Right. Now, what does that look like? That means, and I'll use the British Columbia example that I always remember of having some of the First Nations elders participating with the teams and developing, and I'm going to be very explicit about this, using behavioral examples that are representative of the First Nations community. So, for example, we might have 3 general rules about respect yourself, others, and property, about respect, responsibility, safety. Those are pretty general, mostly acceptable across multiple cultures. But what respect looks like in a given culture and the examples of what it looks like might vary. And I think those examples have to be generated by students, family, community members, and staff members collectively. Right. And a set of agreements that are made about, yes, we all agree that respect in the hallway is walking to the right, but we're not going to focus on eye contact because eye contact culturally can become offensive to some. But we're going to focus on walking to the right, and we're going to focus on, whatever, hands to self, because that's okay. We're not going to use high fives because physical contact in some cultures is not appropriate. So whatever. I think it's important for the specific behavioral examples be reflective of I'll use my words, behaviors or skills or whatever of the community, and that they have to become involved. We get in trouble when just the team by themselves develop. Now, in all honesty, some of the teams are pretty good about being sensitive to what their cultures are about, but it becomes much more real if there are actually members of those communities, students in particular, family members, and community members participating, maybe not in the team meetings, but in some of the follow-ups around generating, as you know, the teaching matrix or one of those behavioral examples. But the examples is the key. The examples have to reflect the learning histories of the people who are participating.
And that certainly creates an inclusive environment right from the start. It also sends the message when you have, Indigenous elders, if you have community members, if you have the various cultures that are represented in the school participating in the process from the beginning, there is a kind of sponsorship to those expectations as well that occurs by simply the presence and the meaningful contribution there.
Right.
I want to pull back the lens a little bit to social emotional learning, because this is another area that I find curious, where there seems to be this tension And again, sometimes it's in cyberspace, it's on social media, et cetera, and our need to create dichotomy. It's, the statements I sometimes hear from people, it's like, oh, no, we do SEL, we don't do PBIS. So my question to you, George, is what is your view of the relationship between the implementation of school-wide PBIS supports and systems and the development of social emotional competencies? What is your view of that relationship?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity for symbiotic stuff going on between the two. I
Mm-hmm.
don't see them as being either or. I don't see them as being counter. I do find some of the assumptions behind PBIS and SELs being somewhat in conflict, especially around, as we just discussed, around the use of tangibles and so forth.
Right,
There are
right.
some things that are counter to the theory, the conceptual framework of the two systems.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I have to say that the PBIS Center has done a phenomenal job of developing examples as well as guidelines for how to merge things like SEL,
Mm-hmm.
things like merging character education with PBIS,
Mm-hmm.
things like merging bully proofing programs and trauma informed strategies with PBIS.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they are counter therapeutic or counterproductive. I think they can be easily merged together. There does have to be a little bit of give, I think, on some of the basic premises. I mean, this notion, and one of my perspectives is you got to teach social skills directly,
Mm-hmm.
as like you would teach reading. And I think the promoters of SEL may not have that strong of a perspective. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
strong believer that you need to have external feedback on how kids are doing socially. That may not
Mm-hmm.
be a strong proponent of SEL communities.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you go to many of the SEL sites and you look up the research base for them, you'll find a number of the practices as being the same practices that are being promoted
Mm-hmm.
within the PBIS collection of practices. I find that one of the best ways to show the integration is to start broad, meaning that PBIS is a framework. It has some ways of organizing what we do for everybody, what we do for some, what we do for a few. Let's take our SEL perspectives, our outcomes, and our practices and organize them all, some, few. Let's use our teams as a way to build those structures and put them in place.
Mm-hmm.
Let's use our teaching matrix where we have respect, which we all agree upon as being important, and tweak the examples so that it reflects both SEL as well as, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's more room for mergers than there are for, okay, fine, let's continue to collect our data on what kids are doing in the hallway and our discipline referrals. But yes, let's also look at kids' surveys and their voice in how they're experiencing this, because their voices reflect what they're experiencing. Lots of room for overlap. I think we
Mm-hmm.
spend way too much trying to separate the two
Right.
rather than trying to merge the two. I do think you have to acknowledge that there are certain things that are going to be people are going to be much more tenacious about hanging on to. And
Right.
those are things that the teams are just going to have to deal with. Excuse me, I
Just
just kicked my computer there.
That's all good, George. Yeah, no, I definitely see the overlap myself, and I think, like you, as you say, and listeners would be familiar with me, ranting many times about this. For whatever reason, we have this need to create dichotomies and try to create contradiction, and I don't know if that's just performative or what it is, but for me, I see so much overlap. I think that the goal of any PBIS system is to develop independent thinkers to help students become more self-regulatory, both academically and behaviorally. And so that's where the SEL competencies come in. And sometimes, I've read some recent research that said it's important for both sides to really acknowledge the other side, that it might be simple in an environment where you have low rates of antisocial behavior. It might be easier to say, well, we just start with SEL competencies, but a school that is trying to navigate through high rates of antisocial behaviors and high rates of office discipline referrals, they may not be in a place where they can start with those SEL competencies. They need to sort of, if for lack of a better word, they need to correct the context
Right.
before forging ahead with that. So it's an interesting overlap in terms of what does and it goes back to something you've said last week and this week, which is context, and looking at the context and making sure that context matters.
Right. And the only thing I'd add to that is, and you sort of alluded to it already, is that I think it's important to kind of pay attention to whether the students are benefiting from what we're doing.
Right.
You know, I think if 80% of the kids are doing fine with SEL, PBIS, SEL, whatever, cool, go for it, right?
Yeah.
And you can document that impact, go for it. But if you have kids who are actually struggling with trying to manage their own behaviors, with understanding how to manage their anger the right way,
Hmm.
and the SEL or whatever curriculum is not being successful in getting there, it may be a time to start saying we probably need to intensify the supports we're providing, and that's where
Hmm.
tier 2 and tier 3 comes in.
Right.
But if you can't get to 80%, I'd argue that we probably got to step back and take a look at what we're doing.
Right. Yeah. Consider context and certainly look for the overlap as opposed to constantly creating these divisions. I just
Right.
find it, as as each year that I move through my career, I just finding myself more and more looking for similarities, overlap, and really trying to, as forcefully as I can, you know, implore people to stop looking for these divisions and stop looking for these silos. I want to shift a little bit to tier 2 now, because I have found, and I still continue to hear this idea that educators, I think you alluded to this last week, this idea that we want to jump from tier 1 to tier 3. And I find sometimes that, the idea that if the school-wide approach, classroom approach is not effective, then they need an individualized plan. And I often find in some ways that tier 2 may be the key to an effective and efficient school-wide implementation of a three-tiered framework or three-tiered approach to behavioral and academic support. Would you subscribe to that in many ways, that tier 2 is kind of a linchpin, if you will, that schools can, if they're successful at tier 2, that it can really be a breakthrough for them in terms of a school-wide model?
Yeah, and I think you've alluded to it as well. I think people jump too quickly from tier 1 to tier 3 with respect to the kind of decisions they make.
Hmm.
I want to kind of reinforce something I mentioned earlier in the part 1. That is, I think it's really important to think about this as being a continuum,
Right.
right? That what varies along that continuum is frequency, intensity, duration of an intervention. Um, a single intervention could actually be reflected in all 3 tiers. It's the intensity of it, its frequency, and so forth.
Right.
I can think of a school that had kids, an alternative school that had
Mhm.
kids with severe behavioral difficulties. All kids had their own behavioral contracts. All kids had a self-management card that was
Mhm.
similar. Tier 1 for all those kids was what we might call tier 3 in a public school,
Mhm.
right? So
Right.
and what was happening at tier 3 in that school was very intensive, highly therapeutic, very specialized, externally provided services. So, tier 3 would probably never happen inside a typical community school, and so forth and so on.
Right.
So I think it's pretty important to kind of keep in mind that it is a continuum as we kind of address this.
Yeah.
Second thing I think you mentioned is that I really like tier 2 because tier 2 is such an efficient way of thinking about how we address kids who need more than tier 1.
Mhm.
It means that we need to tweak the intensity of what we're doing at tier 1 for a few kids who aren't quite getting it. So if I think about the reading analogy, we have kids, we got a tier 1 basal curriculum where all 30 kids are in the same curriculum, and there is Tom, George, and Jane. They're not getting it. So what do? I say, you know what? 3 of you, come over here. We're going to have a little bit of extra practice. We're going to do a little bit more practice on what we just did with the whole class. Guess what? That's tier 2, right? Oh, Tom, you got it now. Great. You don't need to come tomorrow. Stick with tier 1. We'll keep track of you. If you want to join us, you may. You can go up and down based on your performance inside that group. So kid response and using tier 1 as the basis for tier 2, very efficient, very effective. I
Mhm.
mentioned part 1, last week, whatever it
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
that catching kids at the door is a great tier 1 intervention, but you can increase the intensity of what you do with a given kid or group of kids at the door as a way, as again, adding in tier 2. And tier 2 could be on the spot. You can say, oh my gosh, Tom, you look a little upset to me. You can do it right there. It doesn't have to be a
Right.
planned program.
Right.
One last note. I know, we've used as an example, although it's become a misrule that it is the only thing, but as an example of tier 2 is check and check out.
Right.
Now, check and check out is a good example of a strategy that's been tested as a tier 2 strategy. But it could be used as tier 1 and it could be used as tier 3.
Right.
For example, we have 10 kids. They are on check and check out in a classroom of 30 or 2 classrooms of 40 or whatever. 10 kids all doing check and check out. Every hour they get a check and check. I won't go through how it works, but you know how it works. But
Right.
basically they're getting monitored every hour and giving feedback. Turns out that Tom is doing okay with it. So now he only gets checked in twice a day. So we've reduced the intensity of check and check out for Tom. In fact, we've taken a kid who's not in check and check out and we've peer monitored him with Tom so he can get a little extra help from a peer in the classroom. And then there's George over here. Oh my gosh, an hourly check-in is not good enough. He needs to have every 15 minutes and he needs to have a verbal prompt about what he should be doing. So I've moved up the intensity of check and check out, which now looks a little bit like tier 3 for George.
Right.
So check and check out has a lot of versatility to it because you can move it up and down based on kid performance. Now, I want to say again, that check and check out is just an example. There are many other interventions that have the characteristics of tier 2, which is group-based, which is high frequency, and so forth and so on.
Right, right. So I think that it's such an important message because I think so often we say, well, tier 2 interventions are different. They're different things we do with students, and sometimes they can be. But I think if people look more to the increasing of frequency, the increasing of intensity, it's almost more of the same, isn't it? It's more of what we're doing in a more targeted setting, in a more targeted group. That can help open up people's ideas that, oh, do I need a separate set of strategies? Well, not really. It's increasing the frequency with which you interact or increasing the frequency of feedback, the intensity, and all of that as we go through. So yeah, I have always found that tier 2 was, again, I've used this language throughout our 2 parts, the idea of a breakthrough. I know that for me, when I really came to understand what tier 2 was about, I started to realize that is one of the keys to making sure that we had the time, the personnel, the ability to support students who need tier 3 intervention and present us with, in those different various settings. Otherwise, we're almost escalating students into a situation that's not sustainable with that. So for me, tier 2 is definitely a great place to really make sure we get it right from an implementation perspective. Okay, as we finish up today with part 2, George, I want to pull back the lens a little bit, do a little bit of reflection on over the course of your career, and specifically when it comes to PBIS and the implementation of the work of the center. And I want to tackle this in 2 parts, and this may come back to responses that you've already had, and that's fine if it does. But the first part is looking at it from a perspective of the last sort of 25 to 30 years or so. When we sit here today in 2021 and you look back over the course of your career, is there anything that surprises you in terms of, maybe a disappointment? We're going to get to the positives, but let's talk about when you reflect on the last 25 to 30 years, is there an aspect of behavioral support where you feel like, we didn't make as much progress as I thought we would have made when you looked ahead, from the early 1990s and thought, for sure by 2021, this would be reconciled or this would be the norm or something like that. Is there any aspect of the last sort of 25 to 30 years in terms of the implementation of PBIS that you're somewhat disappointed with?
Yeah, I think there's 2, and I mentioned one of them last time, and that is, and I'll state it in a positive way, but we look at our data over every year we take a look at how many schools are, quote, implementing PBIS. And the last count was about 26,000 schools that have been touched by the PBIS framework in some way or some fashion,
right?
Which is great. But what we find is that, and I'm going to get the number probably not as accurate, so I'll just give a general figure, but it's pretty close. Of those 26,000 schools, 60% of them or so are actually checking to see if they're implementing PBIS with fidelity. So I'll say it again. About 60% of the schools are actually checking to see if they're implementing tier 1 with fidelity.
Yeah.
Of that 60%, about 40% are implementing with fidelity. So that's a good thing, right? 40% and 60%. 40% are doing it with fidelity, 60% are checking for fidelity.
Right.
But there's a whole bunch of schools that aren't checking for fidelity, and
Right.
there's a whole bunch of schools that are not implementing with fidelity. Now, optimistically, I'm saying, oh my gosh, they realize they're not implementing with fidelity, so they're going to change. But there's that other group of schools that aren't even checking to see if they're implementing with fidelity. So the good thing is, yeah, they're doing it. The sad thing is they're not checking to see if they're implementing with fidelity. That's
Right.
like saying, gee, I got my flu shot today, but I didn't check to see whether or not, it was the right flu shot, whether or not it was the right timing. I didn't, all that fidelity stuff becomes questionable. We didn't get a second opinion, if you will. I worry about that. Some of my friends say, from a large scale perspective, 26,000 schools is pretty cool, and getting 40% implementing with fidelity is pretty cool at that scale.
Right.
But I'm not satisfied. I'd much rather see 80, 15, 5 for our
Right.
schools.
Right.
The second thing that I struggle with is that the fidelity of implementation goes down dramatically as you move up to tier 2 and tier 3. So from 40 to something like, 20 down to, it drops. The fidelity of implementation drops. Not only the checking of it, but the actual fidelity. I understand that it's difficult to implement tier 3 strategies. I understand that it's difficult to work with kids with severe behavior problems and so forth and so on. But what it tells me is that maybe we're not doing tier 1 very well. What it tells me is maybe we're not implementing or checking our tier 3 strategies very well. It also tells me maybe we're not doing as individualized and as prescriptive as we should be, and so forth. So a lot of questions pop up.
Yeah.
So if there's anything that I would have done differently when we started 30 years ago, would be to emphasize fidelity of implementation across all 3 tiers more aggressively, to make it a requirement of Pbis as opposed to a highly recommended.
Right. And to be very purposeful about checking and making sure that you follow up. Okay, let's finish up with the other side. What has you feeling optimistic? What has you pleasantly surprised as you looked ahead? What did you underestimate and are now pleasantly surprised by in terms of the work as we finish up here?
I love it when people understand that Pbis is a logic and they can apply it to a variety of different contexts. For example, when we experienced some pretty significant school violence, shootings and so forth, when people said, we have to bring our whole community together. What can we do to make sure everybody is being supported? Tier 1. What can we do for those people who are at risk of having trouble making the transition back to school? Tier 2. What can we do for those kids who are high risk, had some direct experiences with the school violence, who are going to need something much more intense? And then they turned around and said, what can we do for all our staff when they come back? And what can we do for some staff who are having trouble kind of wrapping their head around the idea of coming back? And what can we do for those staff who actually experience some of that school violence themselves personally and are having trouble even stepping back on the school grounds? I love it when we were starting to come back to school after the pandemic was sort of at its height, and everybody was saying, come back to school, get back to normal, and so forth. I love it when schools were saying, we used our Pbis team to help build a successful transition back to school. We talked about respect, responsibility, and safety, and added into our teaching matrix a little piece around wearing face masks, around making sure that we kept our distance, making sure that, whatever, that they built in the structures that were being used for Pbis as a way to deal with their transition back to school. How they said, we have some kids who are going to come back to school who actually experience death in their families. We might need to reach out to them before they come to school to help them make the transition to school, as opposed to waiting for them to come to school and act out their trauma when they come to school. I loved it when I saw those kinds of applications of the PBIS guiding principles back to some of those issues.
Mm-hmm.
I look forward to the PBIS schools that are doing this stuff well, using that PBIS thinking as a way, and the framework features as a way of using their data for decision making, making sure they shorten the line between the decision they make in the intervention and the student benefit, making sure student benefit is always at the forefront of decision making, making sure they use their teams, blah blah blah. I mean, to me, when those kinds of things happen, it makes me feel good about being retired because something is happening.
Well, we want you to feel good in retirement, George, that's for sure. Okay, one last question as we finish up today, and it's a question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast, and it's simply a question about success. And the question is simple, and it's this. If a random person were to stop you on the street, George, and ask you, what's your definition of success, how would you answer them?
For PBIS, and I would say that
just
one of the
in
things
general.
that is, one of the things, let me start with that PBS one, just because that's on my mind right now. And that is, I think, and I didn't kind of emphasize this enough, and I should have done it in part 1 and part 2. And that is, I really do appreciate you, Tom, having me on this podcast. And I think, and I really appreciate the chance to be able to talk about PBS. And one of the misrules I think is important to understand that PBIS is not George Sugai. George Sugai did not invent PBIS. Rob Horner and George Sugai did not invent the center. George Sugai did not invent the triangle. What Rob and I and our team did, and I say that purposefully with capital TEAM, all 4 letters capitalized, is what the team did is develop this framework in a way that's responsive to schools' needs and kept student benefit as the focus. I think the success that I really appreciate is that I was able to be part of this larger community. The team as being one, the PBI Center team, but then the larger one of people like yourself and Don Chapman and others who become the implementers and have maintained contact with the PBIS community. That to me is a success. I can go to Australia and see people there that are implementing with fidelity, and it really is quite gratifying. And they teach me about what it looks like there. I can go to Japan and I can talk to people that are implementing there. And even though it's in a different language with a different set of values, I can still see the core features being implemented. That to me is, to see other people be successful is something that I personally find successful for the PBIS team as a whole. I think the general success thing is that I think it's been helpful to me just in my kind of everyday life, if you will. It helped me make my decision about when to retire. It helped the PBIS logic, if you will, help me make decisions about how to develop an IEP for my retirement life. It helped me kind of assess whether or not, so forth and so on. I think it has given me a set of life tools, decision-making tools to kind of help me, as my friend Rob Horner always says, arrange my environment for success, not only for myself, but for my family and my friends, and so forth. Trying to be preventative, trying to be optimistic, trying to be data-based, trying to make decisions based on the best science, trying to stay healthy based on that science. All that stuff has been probably a spin-off of what I've done in the schools, and vice versa. I think it's kind of gone both ways. But the last 2 years and 211 days of retirement have been very positively reinforcing. And I think it's because of kind of my prior experiences and having interactions with people like yourself and others. It's been pretty phenomenal. I'm very grateful for that.
Well, you have had, to say you have had an incredible career is an understatement. Listeners, this is the point where I normally mention our guests' social media handles, how you can follow them, how you can stay in touch with them. But George is retired. And so there is no social media presence for
I
that.
had no
So
social media even before I retired. Yeah,
yeah,
but I'll
perfect.
be,
So
if if you do have questions, direct
yeah,
them towards Tom, and Tom will get them to me.
there you go.
You could. I actually still maintain my Yukon email address,
Okay,
so you can always contact me through that.
great,
I'm
great.
sure Tom can post that, so I'm happy to give
Absolutely.
that out.
I will definitely
Um,
put that, listeners, you will have that in the show notes for contacting with George, and I'd be happy to facilitate anything for folks as well. And George, I just have to say that offer is incredibly gracious. You have made that offer throughout the entire time I've known you. You were incredible to me back in the day in terms of Mike peppering you with questions and understanding. I'm just grateful, to you for not just being here today, but the influence you've had on my career, still have on my career. I still hear you in my ear, even though I'm talking about assessment, I'm talking about grading. There are things that I experienced with you that you taught me that help shape who I am today as an educator. So I just want to thank you again for that, and certainly thank you for being here. And I wish you a happy holidays with for you and your family as well.
I appreciate that very much. And remember, there are certain theoretical frameworks that would say that if you're hearing voices in your head, that's something going on there. But so be careful.
We'll call this.
But
Well,
at the
this
same
is a
time,
positive one.
yeah, at the same time, it's really easy to chat with you. You've done a really nice job with the implementation stuff. I have total confidence in you handling any question that might be directed to me. So, listeners, viewers, take advantage of Tom and his services. I hope the podcast has been helpful to you, and
Right.
please use it as you see fit. And as always, there's a disclaimer here saying good luck, and see what happens.
Right, right. Well, that's very gracious, George. I appreciate the endorsement, and certainly, again, appreciate your time today.
All right, take care of yourself, everybody.